Welcome to the Life of the Difference podcast. Before we start, just a quick note and something I want to make very clear is this episode is sponsored by Novartis, and although they supported the production of this episode, they had no editorial control over the content, the questions asked, or the views shared by me or my guest. This conversation is intended to be educational and reflective, and it is not medical advice. So Professor Flohr, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I think Professor is pretty synonymous with very busy, so I really appreciate it. Do you mind just briefly introducing yourself to start?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm Carsten Flohr. I'm Professor of Dermatology at St John's Institute of Dermatology at King's College London. And I'm also a consultant dermatologist at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in London. And I have a passion for eczema research, including novel ways of preventing the disease, links between eczema and allergic conditions, and novel therapeutics. And I guess that's where the clinical trials come in, that we are going to talk about today. So I'm particularly interested in novel treatments for severe eczema and other inflammatory skin conditions like psoriasis or vitiligo or alopecia areata. And I ran several NIHR-funded clinical trials, including the TREAT trial, which compared methotrexate with cyclosporin to conventional immunomodulatory treatments. This was a pediatric trial in children with eczema. I'm also heavily involved in commercial intervention studies with novel systemic immunomodulatory therapies such as biologics and small molecules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. A big thank you to Lisa Gwilliam from the British Association of Dermatologists for putting us in touch. I really wanted to speak to someone about trial participation with significant credentials. And then I saw your big list, and I thought, yeah, perfect, that'll do. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I think in terms of trial participation, I think we're in a period where the pipeline, particularly in dermatology, is very strong. And a key part of getting medications through that pipeline and approved is trial participation. But I think that there can be a lot of myths, a lot of misinformation, and a lot of people that just simply don't fully understand the process. I understand this is a very big, complex process, I guess, but to try and condense it, would you be able to go over the sort of main stages of developing a medication?
Yes, sure. This is many years of hard work. For many people, usually, typically between 10 to 15 years from an idea to the clinic, all the way from the discovery and laboratory research. So scientists identify potential drug target, for instance, the immune pathway involved in psoriasis or eczema, and then test compounds in the lab, number one. Then preclinical testing has to happen. The drug is tested in cells and then in animals to assess basic safety and whether it might work. And then we're getting into the clinical trials phases from phase 1 to phase 3 and 4. So phase 1, small number of healthy volunteers or patients. Focus there is very much on safety and dosaging. Phase 2 would be larger groups of patients with a condition. We're already testing effectiveness here and side effects again. And then phase 3, that would be the large scale trials comparing the new treatment to standard care or placebo. And then alongside this, there would be a regulatory review. So the regulatory authorities then decide whether the medication can be licensed based on the evidence that's been generated through the various study phases. And then there's usually a post-marketing phase as well. And we sometimes call that phase 4. That's ongoing monitoring once the drug is in routine use. And that could, for instance, be through real-world data collections like the Atopic Eczema Systemic Therapy Register, which I run, where we are following adults and children up who are either starting or switching from one systemic immunomodulatory therapy to the other in NHS clinical practice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so once it's got to that stage of that, I guess it gets to individual countries' own approval systems. What is the system when it comes to specifically the NHS in the UK? So what bodies does it have to move through in order to be prescribed by your dermatologist?
Yeah, pre-Brexit, this was all handled at the European level, and there's
Okay.
a
Okay.
European regulatory body, the European Medicines Agency. But since Brexit, the MHRA has taken on, again, a bigger role. So that's the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. And they assess the safety, the quality, and the effectiveness of a medication. And then Once they're happy, they would hand this over to the National Institute for Clinical and Care Excellence, NICE, for an assessment. So they evaluate whether the treatment works well enough and offers, and this is important in the UK context, value for money. So they're doing a health economics piece as well. And
Hmm.
then there is NHS commissioning. And if NICE recommends a treatment, the NHS must fund the treatment within 90 days in England. And only after these steps can a drug be routinely prescribed on the NHS.
Hmm. And I regularly talk to patients, and I mentioned that I'm a patient advocate, and they want to help, but they're not sure the ways in which they can help. And this is one where lived experience is quite useful. So particularly for the NICE appraisal of medications. So for example, I was on the appraisal for a specific biologic, and they get patient experts in to talk about their lived experience, why they think it's important, and try and, I guess a part of it is pull on the heartstrings a little bit and try and express how difficult a condition can be to live with, and why a certain medication can bring value for money. So that is where people can potentially get involved. Can I potentially ask you a question that's a little bit off script? Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure.
I've seen a lot of things in the news about the QALY situation. The way I understand it is that that is how NICE assess whether something is value for money. And I've seen one side of the argument that that threshold needs to be raised, but the NHS is essentially saying they haven't got the funding to do so. Do you have any thoughts on that situation?
So what has happened is that historically the NICE has said we'll fund a medication if it's cheaper than £30,000 for improvement in quality adjusted life years, which is what you are referring to, QALYs. Now, QALYs advantage is that you can use this as a generic quality of life measure, and then you can put a value on it in thousands of pounds across the diseases. But it's not, so it's not a skin disease specific or even a generic skin disease measure, but it works for all diseases. And there's a, a, a generic quality of life measure that's the EQ5D, it's called, which was developed at the European level to assess quality of life across any condition. So that's from a NICE perspective, it's a very simple measure. It can be used for any disease, and then you could put a monetary value on it. But the £30,000 cutoff is completely arbitrary. And then all the resources are being restrained, and we have to do more cost cutting. You may want to set the cutoff at a higher level rather than a lower level.
Okay. I see. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. Yeah, I kept seeing it propping up. And so, yeah, nice to get an explanation on that one. Thank you. And going back to clinical trials, in very plain language for the layman, what is a clinical trial?
A clinical trial is a standard vehicle that measures the effectiveness of a medication, and it's different from an observational study. So when we use the term trial in a very strict sense, we mean an intervention study, usually where patients are randomized either to standard care and a novel treatment, or the novel treatment and placebo. And it's a computer that decides which of the two arms. And sometimes these intervention studies with medications have got more than two arms, but what arm a participant goes into is decided by computer randomization.
Hmm. Okay. Is there any particular myths or misconceptions that you personally see when it comes to trial participation?
I mean, a lot of people think they might be treated like a guinea pig. Um,
I've heard that one definitely. Yeah.
Trials only for people with no other options. They might say that doctors won't act in my best interest, or I won't know what treatment I'm getting. In reality, trials are highly regulated, they're ethically reviewed, and participant safety comes first.
Hmm. And so it's one that I've heard personally is that um, essentially pharma control the whole thing, and pharma are obviously heavily incentivized to produce the data that supports their medication. But I understand that's very much not the case, that pharma have limited control quite early on. Is that correct?
Well, pharma designed the protocol of the trial, and of course,
Hmm.
would design the protocol of a trial in a way that they think they might guess the best, might get the best outcome. Now, that includes, for instance, a washout period. So patients are very often taken off medication that they're currently on. What then happens is disease severity very often goes up during that washout period, and then they're starting the new medication or placebo or standard care. But you're changing the delta, of course, because if someone is more severely affected,
Hmm.
e- that change only happens for short periods of time as they're going through the washout period.
Hmm.
That will be more efficacious, statistically speaking, as you're then doing the data analyses. But having said that, any trial protocol gets independently reviewed before it is accepted by the MHRA and the research ethic committees. So,
Hmm.
I mean, pharma, of course, want to show that their drug works, and they would usually only, and this is frustration for people like me who want to know as clinician which one is the best treatment out of the ones that have currently got available or might have available in the future.
Hmm.
But pharma will usually only do placebo-controlled trials by and large. Occasionally we get head-to-head trials. They are the real trials that we need, of course, because they inform us which treatments are the best, rather
Hmm.
than
Hmm.
being better than placebo.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. In terms of the washout period, because that's something that I think patients find quite daunting, that even when they're in a situation where they need symptom relief, there's some reassurance and comfort, I guess, in their kind of existing medication routines, and so the idea of giving that all up can feel quite daunting. So I guess just from a dermatological perspective, would it be the case that all medication needs to stop, or would it be the case that it's more systemic, serious medications that stopped, i.e., you can still use moisturizers, but you're not using topical steroids, for example?
Yeah, so in most trials, you will still be able to use moisturizers, and the use of the moisturizer will be standardized during that run-in phase into the trial before
Hmm.
people started on medication. But what often is the case is that topical anti-inflammatory treatments are stopped.
Hmm.
Having said that, once people are in the trial, a lot of trials allow people to use anti-inflammatory treatments as well as the emollients up to a certain level.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, I think, again, that's another misconception I've heard a lot, is that you need to be a complete blank slate. Um, but there seems to be a lot of thought that goes into making it as least uncomfortable as possible. In terms of the sort of day-to-day reality of a clinical trial visit, because again, I think that's a hurdle for people in what exactly is involved with a clinical trial visit. And I know there's normally different tests done at different stages, but sort of on average, what would a clinical trial visit look like for a patient?
Yeah, I mean, most dermatology trials are quite similar, at least in terms of the basics. So there will definitely be a skin examination. Someone will do a severity scoring for psoriasis or eczema or whatever disease it is. There's usually a validated score that the clinicians would use to assess the disease severity. And you usually have to be at a certain threshold of the disease severity using one of these validated scores to be allowed to get into the trial. And for the trials that are testing the systemic medications, that's usually quite high,
Hmm.
different from the topical treatment trials. Photographs, quite, quite often with consent, of course, and then blood tests, partly for safety. Some of these trials are quite interested in looking at biomarkers. So it could be even novel biomarkers, looking at immune profiles that might predict treatment response or adverse event profiles. We sometimes take non-invasive samples like tape stripping, which is a way of standardized, in a standardized way. It's like cellulotape, essentially, put on the skin several times. We're lifting up skin cells in a non-traumatic way, and that allows you allows us to look at immune cells and the chemicals that they secrete. So that can be quite interesting. Questionnaires about symptoms, quality of life, mental health, and then the patient would receive the topical treatments or the injection or tablets. And if it's injections, usually early on into the trial, at least that medication is then given by a research nurse Occasionally, our trials actually allow patients to give the treatment. Once they're established in trial on a medication, they can sometimes give the medication themselves at home after they've been shown how to use it. Visits are often longer than routine NHS appointments because the monitoring is more detailed.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
the advantage is you've got that direct lifeline to the research team. And the research teams are very dedicated. You get a lot of attention, probably more attention than you would get if you were a routine NHS patient. So there are, you have to spend a bit of more time in the visits, but you get a lot of attention, and you have a direct lifeline. Also, if something happens to you, you can ring them up, send them an email. So they'll be very responsive that way.
Yeah, I think that's really important for people to hear. I think people have that concern that if they, for example, experience side effects, etc., then it's going to be difficult to get hold of the person they need to. Being in the NHS, with it being quite stretched, sometimes, when you need to reach out, it can be difficult to get in front of the right person. But yeah, from my experience with trials, that very much wasn't the case. There was that direct line, and appointments moved quite smoothly. Something to prepare people for is that at one point I had to do the photos, and I thought it would be a nurse with a little digital camera, but it was like a studio with big flashing lights and a big camera. And all of a sudden, I'm on a stage in my pants doing all sorts of poses. So just to prepare yourself for that one. And for me personally, no matter how many blood tests I have, I still am not keen. I never let it hold me back. I never let it get in the way of anything, but really not a big fan. But obviously, blood tests are quite a routine part of clinical trials. Would you say it's quite normal to have a blood test for every visit for a clinical trial?
Definitely not. But initially, trials are more intense.
Mhm.
And that tends to be up to what we call the primary endpoint of a trial. That's the most important outcome measurement time point. And typically is at 12 to 16 weeks or so, sometimes 24 weeks into being in the trial. And then usually everything relaxes a little bit. A lot of trials then move into what we call the open label extension phase, where even those who were on placebo, if it is a trial that includes a placebo arm, will then move on to the real stuff, which, which of course is an important buy-in for patients to take part in placebo-controlled trials, but also it makes the trials more ethical because
Mhm.
certainly as a clinician, I would not want my team to take part in a trial where a patient will only get placebo or has a chance to get placebo. And that's been taken on board. So the later phase trials certainly usually have that intense phase with blood taking, the first
Mhm.
3, 4 months or so, and then things relax, but also patients travel into the real medication usually, even if
Mhm.
enough for the computer to put them in the placebo group at the beginning.
Yeah, that's definitely a good one to touch on. That's one I hear a lot, is that this concern that they're going to go through this whole process, which is a logistical and probably emotional burden, to then not receive the medication at all. So that's nice to know that even if you are kind of one of the unlucky ones at the start, you will get it in the end. In terms of this feeling of, I've heard before people talk about being locked in, and they're concerned that once they start, they will feel a pressure to continue. Um, I guess, do you have reassurance that that's not the case? Is it the case that patients are freely allowed to leave a trial at any time with kind of almost no questions asked, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is always the wording in the consent forms as well. Participants can leave at any time for any reason without giving an explanation and without affecting their usual medical care. That's really important. And there should be no pressure or resistance from the research team.
Thank you. In terms of let's say a patient goes onto the trial, takes the medication really helps them, really eases their symptoms, and it's very much been worth their while, I suppose. Once the trial comes to an end, what happens then in terms of continuing on with that medication?
Yeah, I already mentioned the open label extension studies. They can sometimes go on for years. A lot of companies commit to providing or extending their open label extension studies until their medication is fully licensed and available in NHS clinical practice. So that's quite common, but not always the case. And then there are compassionate use programs. So if, let's say, a trial ends before the drug is available in NHS clinical practice, some of those companies offer a compassionate use program that the clinicians will run the trial can apply to for their specific patient. And then it's the company that pays for the medication before it is covered by the NHS.
Mhm. Mhm.
If neither is available, then patients may need to wait until regulatory approval is in place, which can take 1, 2, maybe even 3 years after successful phase 3 trial. But I've not come across this scenario before. And the other thing to remember is, so far, certainly in the context of psoriasis or atopic eczema, even if it's a novel eczema or psoriasis trial, and that medication was not available yet at the end of the trial, we now have so many other novel systemic medications available in NHS practice that we could usually switch the patient to. So they're not losing out that way usually. And the other thing to say is that being part of a trial often gives you access to a new treatment well before, years before NHS patients would get it. And you often don't have to travel through a conventional, by that I mean immunosuppressive immunomodulatory therapy. So essentially you're jumping the queue that way through the trial. And once you've fulfilled, you have been on an advanced therapy through a trial, you fulfill the nice criteria for being on another advanced therapy. You do not step back into, starting from scratch in the NHS context in terms of the sequence of treatments, if I'm making sense.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, that process can feel like a very, very long process when you're really, really suffering, and understandably, there's steps you have to move through. And I guess if there's a way to sort of fast track those steps, I think that's a massive incentive for people to get involved. In terms of, I've heard quite a bit about a lack of diversity in trial participation, and there's certain demographics who are not being involved in trials. Why is it that trial participation diversity is important? And is there any demographics in particular that you see a lack of representation from?
Yeah, so I mean, skin diseases affect people differently. For instance, based on age, skin type, genetics, ethnicity, and without diverse participants, treatments may be less effective, less safe for underrepresented groups. Side effects may be missed. Results may not reflect real world patients, including young people, helps to ensure treatments work across the full age range as well. Any particular demographics that specifically underrepresented would be people with darker skin tones, young adults, older adults with multiple conditions. So because the clinical trials are very artificial constructs when it comes to what's allowed in terms of comorbidities, other coexisting health conditions, clinical trial patients tend to be, relatively speaking, healthier than the population out there that very often get treated with the medications that's being tested. Then people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have got a tendency to take part in trials less, and then ethnic minority communities exactly the same. And this is very well recognized. And we're trying to actively address these issues. There's a big drive, for instance, within the NIJAR to broaden the diversity in the participation. There is now investment in commercial research delivery centers, which have been set up across England, and they're even recruiting into studies in social care settings, elderly people's homes, and prisons, in the quest to bring in populations and give benefits to people who usually don't take part in clinical trials.
Mhm. I think that's brilliant. That's really, really important work. I definitely feel as if um, clinical trials can very much feel like a privilege of the middle class in a way. I was an electrician. I was working around the clock. And I remember I was offered to be put onto a trial that I very much wanted to be on, but it involved me coming in and out of London multiple times, and it just simply wasn't a possibility. So I definitely think that push towards uh, just making it logistically easier. In terms of payment for trials, is there ever payment for trials to cover people's lost time? Is that allowed from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it payment.
Okay.
that would not be allowed. It's reimbursement is what
Okay.
I'm saying, really, and then that is to compensate people for the effort of time, but also some. If we take if a research study takes samples, sometimes we even take skin biopsies. In dermatology studies, skin is so accessible. So again, to look at immune cells, for instance, to be leaving a scar. Well, I mean, there you would definitely get some additional payment, but usually it's travel, parking, time off work,
Hmm.
meals, all of that should be reimbursed. The other thing to say is, I mean, you were saying you worked as an electrician, you were very busy. It was very difficult for you to travel to a clinical trial site. There is a push towards remote clinical trials where everything is done remotely. And that can be done in dermatology, in part because the skin is visible. We can do severity assessments through apps, medical photography, even consenting can be done remotely. And so the UK Dermatology Clinical Trials Network is currently running a series of eczema trials that are entirely remote. And interesting about those trials is not only that they're remote, but they're also happening in very close collaboration with patients. In fact, it's the patients that are co-leading these remote clinical trials with the experts, and the patient panel in this program grant has decided on the priority of which trials they want to run.
Hmm. Excellent. Brilliant. Yeah, that's brilliant to hear. Okay. In terms of in terms of trial duration, I'm not sure if we touched on this already. How long do you tend to be kind of signing up for if you do decide to enter a trial?
It depends on the phase of the trial. So the early phase trials I talked about, weeks to months. Phase 2 to 3 can be 2 years or longer. I mean, the
Hmm.
biggest phase 3 trial that I've run with my team was over 6 years. And then extension studies, again, several years, and one into the other, as I said. So very often, phase 3 trial will then, I mean, the trial name might change, but essentially it's the same population that moves from the mother trial, the initial one, with
Hmm.
randomization to different arms, different doses, potentially placebo arm as well,
Hmm.
to the medication that is being
Hmm.
tested. And everybody then is on that medication to be followed up for years, looking at treatment effectiveness and safety profiles.
Hmm.
Especially, adverse events take time to develop often, and therefore it's really helpful running these trials for much longer rather than the initial intense phase up to that primary endpoint that I
Hmm.
mentioned earlier.
As to the slightly off-piste one, but in terms of the drug development process, obviously, as a patient who is not receiving the relief that they want from their symptoms, that process can sound like an absolute age. And obviously, it's absolutely fantastic in terms of safety, etc. But is there any scope at all, or any discussion about, or is there any kind of pathway to bringing down development times, or is that just kind of set in stone from a safety perspective?
Yeah, you mean bringing molecules even more quickly into a clinical trial setting?
I guess so, because the pipeline. So, for example, just from a dermatology perspective, the pipeline sounds fantastic, and I hear about all these, new and novel treatments that are potentially coming out, and then you hear, and that might be with you in 4 years, and your heart sinks a little bit. But yeah, do you think in the future at all there may be a way to lessen that time, or do you think it will always be? I believe is it kind of sort of between the 5 and 10 year mark is standard.
I said earlier, I think 10 to 15 years
Mhm. Mhm.
from the discovery laboratory research to the post-marketing phase for, I mean, companies are increasingly using AI to identify molecules. So that might shorten the time period and the trial and error that's happening. That's at the phase of identifying molecules, doing laboratory research. I mean, the safety testing has to happen, doesn't it? So, and that would involve animal testing as well. I can't see the traditional trial phases changing very much from phase 1, 2 to 3, but COVID obviously taught us that platform trials may be the way forward, and people using, as in repurposing existing drugs that are being licensed or have been licensed in other disease areas and have been used for years in those contexts may actually be useful for other diseases as well. And in that context, I guess, you can cut the corner a lot. You don't have to go through the full early phase discovery laboratory research as you
Hmm.
if you start with a molecule from scratch.
Hmm. Hmm. I was speaking at Patients as Partners last year, and there was a lot of different companies there talking about ways in which they're going to assist in trials and development. You know, whether it's even as simple as, well, I say it's simple, it's definitely not simple, but using AI to um, decrease the administrative load and burden that comes with clinical trials and things like that. So that should all hopefully assist in terms of finding clinical trials. So I'm very fortunate in that I'm under St John's Institute of Dermatology at Guy's, and so I get to speak to some very high level dermatologists, and so I hear about these clinical trials through that route. If you're somebody who, say, for example, is even stuck at primary care and is unable to get that dermatology appointment, how can you find out about potential trials?
Yeah, so I mean, as you would be talking to your dermatologist, that's a good idea. You can talk to your GP, of course. Check hospital research websites. A lot of, so it'd be the local hospital research website. There's a UK clinical trials gateway that is accessible. Then there is clinicaltrials.gov, which again is publicly available. And so you can put the disease name in and see what trials are open. That would be a global register of clinical trials, but you would see where the lead site is, and it would usually indicate where the study is running in terms of which countries. And then the UK Dermatology Clinical Trials Network, I think, would be a really useful place to go for the UK specifically. So the UK DCTN runs non-commercial trials and has a website. And so, for instance, they're currently open for a clinical trial of acne dosing with Roaccutane, high dose versus low dose. And if someone is interested in taking part, they can find the contact details for that team on the UK Dermatology Clinical Trials Network website. And then there
Perfect.
are patient charities and research networks. There's the British Skin Foundation. There is the Psoriasis Association. There's the National Eczema Society, Eczema Outreach Support, and all of these different patient charities usually also showcase the currently ongoing trials specific to that disease area.
Mhm. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. And if you are a patient listening and you want to um, maybe you don't even want to get involved in clinical trials directly, but you want to help overall in the development process. As I mentioned earlier, you can be involved in the NICE appraisal as a patient expert. There's also a qualification that I'm currently doing, the UPATI Patient Expert Program, which when you get your qualification, you can then be involved earlier in the medication development process. So if anyone's looking to become involved more in advocacy, there's certainly you're certainly very much needed. Thank you very much for your time, Professor Flohr, and I hope I didn't rapid fire you too much with all those questions. I just wanted to make sure to use our time wisely. And thank you very much for all the work you're doing for patients like me. We very much appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, but also being so much involved in the research. And we couldn't do this without patients. And it's great to have patients as part of the journey of a clinical trial, all the way from having the initial idea. And I now routinely include patients even in the protocol writing. They can be very helpful in designing the patient information that we would be using as part of the clinical study. And then we have patient partners on our oversight committees. Didn't really so much talk about the oversight committees in the podcast so far, but maybe important to mention there's usually a
Yeah, please. Yeah.
steering committee, and that includes patients, and then an independent data monitoring committee, which looks at the safety signals from the trial. Again, making sure that there is no harm done to patients as new treatments are being tested or existing treatments are being tested. And if a data monitoring committee discovers that there is harm being done, then sometimes these clinical trials actually get stopped early. Or if it's very clear that one treatment is so much better than another, if there is massive superiority, again, that's quite a rare scenario, but if that happens, sometimes a clinical study gets stopped earlier than planned as well.
Hmm. Could I just very quickly touch on something else that I see personally as a patient advocate, is I see a lot of pushback against pharma. I see a lot of pushback against traditional science the right word? Essentially, medical science. I see a lot of holistic medicine coming back. I see a lot of you know, gut microbiome stuff and things like that. Does do you find that makes your job a little bit harder in that I do feel like there is some skepticism growing of pharma in general?
Yeah, I mean, but a degree of skepticism is quite healthy,
Mhm.
but it has to be informed. And it's important to be aware that we wouldn't be where we are in skin diseases or any other disease without the pharmaceutical industry, even if we said, as we said at the beginning, yes, they want to show that their drug works better than placebo, potentially better than other drugs. But at the same time, a lot of these medications can really change people's lives, even if pharmaceutical companies are companies and they want to earn money. So without that investment, we wouldn't have the medical advances that we do. In terms of complementary medicine, um, yes, there is a lot of interest in that. I'm always interested in hearing from my patients what they're using. I usually tend to ask about homeopathy or traditional Chinese medicine. I have no problems with people using those medications. But what I'd love to do is to test some of these interventions in the context of a clinical trial. In fact, many years ago, I tried to get funding for a homeopathy trial, but unfortunately didn't get the resources that I needed to do it. I haven't seen any conventionally conducted trial that convincingly shows benefit. There was a couple of trials that were done by a colleague at Great Ormond Street several years ago with traditional Chinese medicine, suggesting there may be a little bit of benefit in eczema. The effect wasn't very large, but so I'm open-minded, but I do think that clinical trials conducted in a robust way are the best vehicle to test whether treatments work or don't work, are better than placebo or potentially not better than placebo. And that's important to know about as well.
Mhm. I still shudder when I think about Chinese herbal medicine, the taste of it, my word. I tried growing up, I tried anything and everything, and that was, that was one of them. I didn't find it helped me particularly, but God, that, that was tough to get down, I tell you. I think I was quite young, and so my mum and dad let me have a little sweetie as soon as I was done.
So what the traditional Chinese medicine practitioner or the homeopathist would say is that
Mhm.
our conventional way of running clinical trials is not the way to assess their medication because the prescribing happens in an individualized way. So eczema is not eczema, hypertension is not hypertension between different patients. They would get slightly different preparations or, different herbs are being mixed or different homeopathic potencies, as they say, would be tested. And they say it's not one size fits all. And this is where there's a clash between the methodologies and the theories behind traditional medicine and as in conventional Western medicine, if you like, and traditional medicine, whether it's Chinese, homeopathic, or Ayurvedic medicine. And so we don't speak the same language, and that the patients sometimes obviously, see it in the same way. So, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. Is there anything as a professor, as a doctor, speaking to patients who are considering trials, or maybe are in a situation where they're not getting relief from their symptoms and it's kind of on their radar? Is there anything else that you think is good information for them to know?
No, I think we've covered it all. I strongly encourage patients to not be shy asking questions about clinical trials and do get involved. And even if it's not being a patient in a trial, to if someone has a skin disease too, and they have the time, like you, then to get involved in maybe a trial committee or in some other way, get stuck in with the research because we really need that patient participation. And in the end, obviously, it's all about improving the lives of patients. If we as researchers have grandiose ideas, but they don't really make a difference to our patients' lives, then there's not much point in doing that type of research. So I mean, it's easier for me to say as a clinical researcher compared to someone who is doing basic laboratory research. We obviously need both because that's where the clinical trials very often start in the first place.
Yep. Yep. Definitely. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time again. Hugely appreciate.
No, you're welcome, and thank you for having me.